Every tragedy begins with the illusion of perfection. And for David and Julia West, that illusion was their life. From the outside, they were the perfect couple. Their suburban home, the kids, the cars, everything about them screamed success. David was a driven businessman, constantly traveling, while Julia was a devoted mother. To their friends, family, and neighbors, they seemed to have it all. But as it often goes, appearances can be deceiving. For years, David had been consumed by work. His frequent absences and long hours meant that Julia spent more and more time alone. At first, it didn't bother her. She understood his ambition. But over time, the loneliness crept in. She found herself missing the closeness they once had, the conversations, the affection. She felt invisible. It was during one of David's many business trips that Julia met Ryan Carter, a contractor hired to renovate their kitchen. He was attentive, charming, and most importantly, present. What started as casual conversations about paint colors and floor tiles soon became something more intimate. Ryan listened to her in a way David hadn't in years. Julia found herself laughing again, smiling in ways she hadn't in ages. She was drawn to him, and before long, their relationship crossed the line from friendly to forbidden. Their affair was passionate, secretive, and intoxicating. Each stolen moment with Ryan filled a void in Julia's life, and as her feelings for him deepened, her marriage to David felt like a distant memory. But the guilt weighed heavily on her, especially when David came home and tried to rekindle their relationship, oblivious to her betrayal. It wasn't long before David noticed the subtle changes in Julia, her distant gaze, the way she flinched at his touch, the whispered phone calls when she thought he wasn't around. But David was so focused on his work that he dismissed these signs, telling himself that they were just going through a rough patch. Then everything came crashing down. David came home unexpectedly from a business trip, eager to surprise Julia. Instead, he found her in their bedroom with Ryan. The shock of seeing his wife in the arms of another man sent David into a rage. He stormed out of the house without saying a word, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, anger, and revenge. Julia was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. She begged for forgiveness, but David was too hurt to listen. He moved into the guest room, and the house became a war zone of silent tension. Julia's affair had destroyed their marriage, but the nightmare was far from over. David's world was unraveling. His anger toward Julia and Ryan consumed him. But beneath the fury was a gnawing fear. The fear that everything he had worked so hard for, his marriage, his family, his career, was falling apart. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the constant replaying of the betrayal in his mind. The worst part was that Ryan wasn't just any man. He was calculating. David started to notice small things at first. Unusual activity on his bank accounts, unfamiliar numbers calling his phone, anonymous messages that felt like threats. Someone was watching him, and they wanted him to know it. David tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress, but when the threats escalated, he knew something was seriously wrong. One evening, he received a text from an unknown number. "You don't know the whole story, but you will, soon." The message made his skin crawl. He showed Julia, hoping for answers, but she claimed to know nothing. She was just as terrified. They were both being watched, manipulated. David suspected Ryan, but he couldn't be sure. Julia had tried to end things with Ryan after David found out, but Ryan wouldn't let go. He had become possessive, dangerous. The threats didn't stop. In fact, they only became more frequent and more specific. David's paranoia grew. He hired a private investigator to dig into Ryan's background, desperate for some kind of leverage. What the investigator found shook David to his core. Ryan was not just a contractor. He was a con man with a history of deception and fraud. He had used his charm to manipulate women before, and it seemed that Julia was just his latest mark. But this time, it wasn't just about seduction. It was about something bigger, something darker. Ryan had his sights set on David's business, his money, and his life. The investigator uncovered documents linking Ryan to offshore accounts, shady business deals, and even criminal activity that suggested this was more than a simple affair. It was a calculated plan to destroy David and take everything from him. Armed with this new information, David confronted Julia again. This time, he wasn't just angry. He was terrified. He demanded the truth, all of it. Julia broke down, admitting that she had been manipulated by Ryan, that he had made promises to her, seduced her with the idea of a new life. But when she tried to break things off, Ryan became threatening. Julia confessed that Ryan had begun to blackmail her. He had compromising photos, messages, and videos of their affair. If she didn't leave David and give him access to their joint accounts, he would ruin her. She had been trapped, and now David was trapped too. David's mind raced. This was no longer just about infidelity. This was a full-blown conspiracy. He felt sick to his stomach. Everything in his life was spiraling out of control. The anonymous threats, the strange bank activity, the fear that his every move was being watched. All of it pointed back to Ryan. But Ryan wasn't just threatening David's marriage and his finances. He was threatening their lives. The investigator warned David that Ryan had been linked to violent crimes in the past, that people who got in his way often ended up disappearing. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. But deep down, he knew it was true. That night, David made a decision. He wasn't going to be a victim anymore. He was going to take matters into his own hands. David's first move was to secure his family. He arranged for Julia and the kids to stay with her parents out of town while he figured out his next steps. Julia was terrified, but she trusted David to protect them. For the first time in months, they were on the same side, working together to keep their family safe. David also ramped up security around his house and his business. He hired a security team. He installed new surveillance systems and kept his private investigator on retainer. He wasn't taking any chances. But even with all the precautions, David couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was one step ahead of him. The anonymous messages kept coming, and they were getting more sinister. "You can't hide forever," one message read. "I'll get what's mine." David knew he had to confront Ryan, but he needed proof, solid, irrefutable evidence that would not only expose Ryan, but put him behind bars. The investigator worked day and night, digging into Ryan's past, tracing his financial dealings, and looking for any connection that could bring him down. It was during this time that David discovered something chilling. The investigator had uncovered a connection between Ryan and someone from David's own company. One of David's business partners, someone he had known for years, had been secretly working with Ryan. Together, they had been siphoning money from the company for months, setting David up to take the fall. David felt the weight of the betrayal like a punch to the gut. He had trusted this person, considered them a friend, and now they were part of the plot to ruin him. It was all too much to process. But David knew he couldn't afford to break down now. He had to stay focused if he wanted to survive this. The deeper the investigator dug, the more connections they found between Ryan and David's business partner. Emails, phone calls, and bank transfers painted a clear picture of their plan to destroy David financially and personally. But what David still didn't understand was why. Why had Ryan targeted him? What was his end game? The answer came unexpectedly one night when David received another anonymous message. It's always been about revenge. Revenge. The word echoed in David's mind. He racked his brain, trying to figure out how he could have wronged Ryan. He didn't even know the man before Julia hired him for the renovation. But then it hit him. This wasn't just about Ryan. This was personal. David remembered an old business deal from years ago, one that had ended badly for the other party. A man named Richard Carter had lost everything when David's company had outbid his on a major project. Richard Carter, Ryan's father. David now understood the full scope of the plot. This wasn't just about money or lust. This was about vengeance. Ryan had been plotting his revenge for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And when he found out about Julia's loneliness, he saw his chance. David's revelation that Ryan Carter was seeking revenge for his father's downfall sent chills through him. The pieces were finally coming together. Ryan had seduced Julia not just for the thrill, but as part of a larger plan to destroy David's life from the inside out. Everything Ryan had done, his affair with Julia, his manipulation, his threats, was meticulously calculated to inflict maximum damage. David now had the motive, but he needed more. He needed proof that would not only expose Ryan's intentions, but also ensure that he and his business partner would face the consequences of their crimes. The investigator was already building a case, but David knew time was running out. Ryan was becoming more aggressive in his threats, and it felt like only a matter of time before he made his move. Then, one evening, David received a call from the investigator. They had finally found the smoking gun, a series of encrypted emails between Ryan and David's business partner detailing their entire plan. The emails outlined how they had funneled money out of David's company, how Ryan had orchestrated the affair with Julia, and even how they had planned to frame David for fraud once everything was in place. It was damning evidence, enough to put both men behind bars for years. But just as David was about to celebrate this breakthrough, he received another text from Ryan. "I know what you found. Meet me tonight, or she dies." David's heart stopped. He knew exactly what Ryan meant. Julia. Panic set in as David tried to think of his next move. He couldn't involve the police, not yet. Ryan had made it clear that any sudden moves would cost Julia her life. David had no choice but to meet Ryan and face him head on. They arranged to meet at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. David didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't going in unprepared. He had called the investigator, who assured him that they would be monitoring the situation from a distance, ready to intervene if things went south. When David arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The warehouse was dark, its only source of light flickering from a single overhead bulb. Ryan stood in the center of the room, a sinister grin on his face. Beside him was Julia, her hands tied, her face pale with fear. "You didn't think I'd make it this easy for you, did you?" Ryan sneered as David approached. David tried to keep his cool, even as his blood boiled at the sight of Ryan's smug expression. "It's over, Ryan," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos raging inside him. "I know everything. Your plan, the emails, the money. You've been exposed." Ryan's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think this is over? I haven't even started. You took everything from my father, and now I'm going to take everything from you." David's heart raced as Ryan pulled out a gun. For a split second, David thought it was the end. But then there was a sudden movement from the shadows. The investigator and his team stormed in, guns drawn, surrounding Ryan before he had a chance to react. The scene unfolded in a blur. Ryan, realizing he had been outsmarted, tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. He was quickly subdued and taken into custody. Julia, shaken but unharmed, ran into David's arms, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed their lives for months had finally come to an end. As the police took Ryan away, David couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Justice had been served. Ryan and David's business partner were both arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and a long list of other crimes. The emails, bank records, and other evidence the investigator had gathered were more than enough to ensure they would both spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But even as David tried to move forward, the scars of the ordeal remained. His marriage to Julia would never be the same. The trust they had once shared was shattered, and despite their best efforts to repair it, the damage was too great. In the end, they decided to separate, realizing that they were better off apart. David's business, though saved from Ryan's clutches, had also suffered. It took months to rebuild, to regain the trust of his clients and partners. But through it all, David remained resilient. He had survived the darkest chapter of his life, and though it had left him scarred, he refused to let it define him. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. David had thrown himself into his work, determined to rebuild what had been lost. Julia, too, had moved on, finding solace in her children and a new start away from the chaos that had consumed their marriage. But the memory of Ryan's betrayal lingered. It wasn't just the affair that haunted David, it was the cold, calculated way in which Ryan had tried to destroy him. It was the realization that someone could be so consumed by hatred, so willing to hurt others, just to settle a personal vendetta. David often found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded, wondering what he could have done differently. Could he have saved his marriage if he had paid more attention to Julia's needs? Could he have prevented Ryan from infiltrating his life if he had been more vigilant? The question swirled in his mind, but he knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was moving forward, learning from the mistakes of the past, and ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. In the aftermath of everything, David found himself wanting to help others avoid the same traps that had nearly destroyed his life. He began speaking out about the dangers of betrayal, manipulation, and deception, sharing his story in hopes that it might prevent others from falling into similar situations. And so, as we close this chapter, let David's story be a cautionary tale for all of us. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it's almost impossible to mend. In a world where deceit can hide behind smiles and friendly gestures, it's crucial to stay vigilant, to communicate openly with those you care about, and to never let complacency blind you to the signs of danger. If there's one lesson to take away from all of this, it's that the cost of betrayal is far too high. Whether in love, business, or friendship, the consequences of dishonesty and manipulation can be devastating, not just for the people directly involved, but for everyone around them. And remember, while it's important to trust, it's just as important to protect yourself. Don't let someone else's lies and schemes tear your life apart. Keep your eyes open, your heart guarded, and never underestimate the lengths some people will go to for revenge.